Welcome to Late Night Calm. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little lower than they are right now. There is nothing to chase tonight, nothing to solve, no place you need to be. Just a story told slowly in a quiet voice, while the world outside goes dark and still. And tonight, the story is about gold, about the men and women who went looking for it, and about the strange truth of who actually found it. Let me begin with a tin pan, an ordinary tin pan, the kind you might use to wash a few dishes, light enough to hold in one hand. It cost about 20 cents. And one day, in San Francisco, a man sold that same 20-cent pan for $15. Not because the pan had changed, not because there was anything special inside it. He sold it for $15 because the man buying it believed with his whole heart that it would make him rich. The man selling the pan was named Samuel Brannan. And here is the part worth holding on to as you drift, the part that turns the whole story upside down. Samuel Brannan became California's first millionaire, the very first, and he never once dug for gold. He never knelt in an icy stream. He never swung a pick at a hillside. He got rich selling pans to the people who did. Sit with that for a moment the way you'd sit with a warm cup before bed. The first millionaire of the gold rush never mined a single ounce of gold. He sold the tools, he sold the flour, he sold the dream. And that one quiet fact is the door we are going to walk through tonight, slowly, level by level, all the way down. Because there is a phrase that historians use for what really happened in those gold rush towns, and it has nothing to do with panning. The phrase is mining the miners, not mining the gold. Mining the miners, the real fortunes, the ones that lasted, almost never came up out of the ground. They came sideways. They flowed out of the pockets of thousands of hopeful diggers and into the pockets of the few people who sold to them, fed them, banked their gold, carried their supplies, and entertained them at the end of a long, cold day. And here is the strange thing about that. Nobody knows exactly when the diggers first understood it. Nobody knows when the merchants first realized that the surest gold in town was the dust already in another man's hand. And nobody can quite agree on why the legend survived so completely. Why we still picture a grizzled old man with a pan and a mule striking it rich, when the truth was almost always the opposite. That gap, that little space between the legend and what really happened, is what we are going to drift down into tonight. So before we go any further, let me ask you something soft, something you can answer in a single, quiet word in your own mind or in the comments if you like. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? A city, a small town, a quiet room, far from anywhere. I genuinely like to know who is drifting off with me, where in the world the dark has settled over you. And if you are new here, if you've just found this calm little corner, you might let yourself subscribe so the next slow story finds its way to you when you need it. There, that's done. Now let the dark be comfortable and let us go back to the gold. Imagine just for a little while that it is your life we are talking about. Imagine you are one of them. The year is around 1849 and the whole world, it seems, has caught the same fever. You have heard the stories, the way everyone has heard them, passed from mouth to mouth and printed in the newspapers. Gold in California. Gold lying in the stream beds, glinting under the water, free for anyone with the courage to go and take it. You sell what you have. You leave what you know. You travel for months by ship around the bottom of the world or overland across deserts and mountains, and you arrive in the diggings with a pan in your hand and your whole future hanging on it. And here, gently, is where the dream begins to come apart. Because for the overwhelming majority of the men who came, the 49ers as they were called, the gold rush did not make them rich. It did not even come close. Most independent miners, working their own claims with their own hands, earned at best wages that were comparable to, or only modestly above, what an ordinary laborer made back east. The same kind of money a man could have earned digging ditches or hauling freight in the city he left behind. And a great many earned far less than that. A great many earned less than what it had cost them to outfit themselves and pay their passage to get there in the first place. They spent more to chase the gold than the gold ever gave back. Let that settle slowly. You crossed an ocean or a continent. You left your home. And at the end of it, on your best day, you were earning roughly what you could have earned by staying. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth that the legends almost never tell you. And why? Why did it work out that way for so many? The reason is simple, almost too simple, which is part of why it surprises people. It comes down to a kind of arithmetic. The gold lying in the stream beds, the gold you could actually reach with a pan and a shovel, and your own two hands is what miners called placer gold. Placer gold is the loose gold, the gold that has already been freed from the rock over thousands of years by water and weather and washed down into the rivers and the gravel. It is the easy gold, the gold near the surface, and the thing about the easy gold is that there is only so much of it. Picture it like this. Imagine a single jar of coins sitting on a table in a quiet room. That jar holds all the easy gold in a stretch of river. Now imagine the door bursts open and not one person but 1,000 people pour into the room, all reaching for the same jar at once. The amount of gold in the jar has not changed, but the number of hands reaching for it has multiplied beyond all reason, so each person's share shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. That is the whole story of why the average miner stayed poor. A fixed amount of accessible gold divided among an exploding number of people. The math was working against you before you ever knelt down in the water, and it happened fast, faster than anyone expected. By 1852, just a few short years after the rush began, the easy surface gold in California was largely worked out, largely gone. Tens of thousands of men had moved through those streams, sifting and washing and turning over the same gravel again and again, and what had once been there for the taking simply was not there anymore. The individual man with his pan, the very image that drew everyone west, was already being pushed aside. What replaced him was machinery, capital, expensive operations run by companies with money, the kind of mining that takes investment and equipment, and many men working for wages, not lone fortune seekers working for themselves. The window for the independent panner to get rich had already swung most of the way shut, and most of the men still arriving did not yet know it. Now I want to be honest with you because honesty is part of what makes a story restful rather than hollow. There was a moment, a real moment, when the gold truly did pour out the way the legends say. Right at the very beginning, in the early days of 1848, before the news had spread, before the masses came, the first men into the streams of California did genuinely well, spectacularly well even. Some of them recovered hundreds of dollars worth of gold in a single day. Hundreds of dollars in a time when a working man might earn $1 or $2 for a hard day's labor. That was real. That actually happened. For a brief, golden window, a man could walk to the water and pull a small fortune out of it. But hold that detail carefully the way you'd hold something fragile, because this is the part that matters most. That brief early window is exactly what built the myth. It was the bait. Those first astonishing returns, the hundreds of dollars a day, were real for a tiny number of people for a very short time. And then the news traveled. It traveled by ship and by letter and by word of mouth, swelling and shining as it went, until it reached every corner of the world. And when hundreds of thousands of people heard that you could pull hundreds of dollars a day out of a California stream, they did not hear the small print. They did not hear that the window was already closing. They heard only the promise. So they came, all of them, by the hundreds of thousands, and they poured into a market that had already turned against them. The first ones in did spectacularly. Everyone else arrived to find the jar already nearly empty, with 1,000 other hands reaching in beside their own. The truth at the start of the rush is what created the lie that ran the rest of it. There is something almost gentle about understanding that lying here in the dark. The men who came weren't foolish. They weren't greedy in any way you or I wouldn't have been. They simply heard a true story about a few lucky people and believed it would also be true for them. And the difference between those two things, between what happened to the first few and what happened to the many, is the whole sorrowful, fascinating heart of the gold rush. Now let me carry you forward in time and across a great distance to a colder place, because the very same pattern played out again almost 50 years later, on the other edge of the continent, in a land of ice and dark. The Klondike, the far northwest, up in the Yukon, in the years between 1896 and 1899. Word came down out of the north that gold had been found there, in the creeks around a place called Dawson City, and once again the whole world seemed to catch fire with the same old fever. And once again the numbers tell a story that is almost the exact opposite of the legend. Of all the people who set out for the Klondike, and the estimates put that number at around 100,000 souls, only some 30 to 40,000 actually reached Dawson City at all. Think about that for a moment as you breathe slowly. More than half of the people who started never even arrived. The journey itself, through mountains and ice and brutal cold, turned back tens of thousands of them, defeated them, sent them home, or worse, before they ever saw the gold fields. 100,000 set out, perhaps 30 or 40,000 made it. And of those 30 or 40,000 who did reach Dawson, only a few thousand seriously searched for gold at all. Many of the rest looked at the reality in front of them and chose to do something else, or simply gave up. And of those few thousand who did search in earnest, only a few hundred actually became rich. A few hundred out of 100,000 who began. And of that small handful who struck it rich, only a tiny number, smaller still, managed to hold on to their wealth in the years that followed. Let those numbers fall through your mind slowly, like snow settling on snow. 100,000 set out. A few hundred got rich. A handful kept it. And here is the cruelest part, the part that turns the whole journey into something almost unbearable to imagine, except that we are warm and safe and far away from it now. By the time most of the stampeders arrived in the Great Wave of 1898, the good claims were already gone. Every one of them. Already staked. The richest ground had been claimed long before the news ever reached the outside world, claimed by the local men who were already there, the ones who happened to be near when the first gold was found. So picture it. Picture yourself among the latecomers. You have sold everything. You have traveled to the very end of the earth. You have survived the journey that broke half the people who started it. And you arrive, frost-bitten and exhausted and full of hope, to discover that there is nothing left to claim. The gold you crossed the world for was spoken for before you ever heard its name. The party was over before your invitation arrived. This is the long odds reality of the prospector. This is the truth underneath the romance. The lone digger with his pan, the image we all carry, the grizzled, hopeful man kneeling at the water's edge, was, far more often than not, a man who was going to go home poorer than he came, if he went home at all. The odds were not just bad, they were structural. They were built into the very nature of the thing. Finite gold divided among an impossible crowd, with the best of it already gone before most of the crowd arrived. And yet money was being made in those towns, real money, fortunes that lasted for generations, fortunes whose names you still know today, even if you've never connected them to gold. The money was there, it was flowing, it was changing hands every single day in those muddy, crowded, freezing boomtowns. It simply was not flowing the way everyone assumed. Go back, in your mind, to that 20-cent pan that sold for $15. Go back to Samuel Brannan running through the streets of San Francisco, because there is more to that story, and it tells you exactly how the real money moved. Brannan was a merchant, a storekeeper, and the story goes that before he ever told a single soul about the gold, before he made any announcement at all, he quietly went around and bought up every pick, every pan, every shovel he could lay his hands on. He cornered the supply. He made sure that he and almost no one else held the tools a man would need to go dig for gold. And only then, only after his shelves were stocked with everything the coming crowds would have to have, did he do the famous thing. He took a bottle of gold dust and he ran through the streets of San Francisco, holding it up and shouting for all to hear. Gold, gold from the American River. And the city emptied into the hills. Men dropped their work and ran for the diggings, every one of them needing a pan, a pick, a shovel. And there was Brannan, the one man in town with a storehouse full of exactly those things. The 20-cent pan became the $15 pan. The man who made the most money at the very dawn of the California gold rush made it not by finding gold, but by selling the dream of gold to everyone else. He sold the shovel and he let other men do the digging, and he grew rich on their hope while they grew tired in the cold water. That is mining the miners. That is the whole secret, sitting right there at the very beginning of the story, hidden in plain sight. The surest gold in any boomtown was never in the ground. It was in the pocket of the next man over, the hopeful man, the man who needed to buy something from you before he could go chase his dream. And the people who understood that, the merchants and the sellers and the bankers and the cooks, those were the people who walked away rich while the diggers walked away empty. And so as we drift down into this story tonight, level by level, through the whole strange pyramid of a gold rush town, I want you to keep that one inverted truth glowing softly in your mind, like a lamp left burning low in another room. The man with the pan, the man we were all taught to admire, was usually the one being mined, and the man selling him the pan was usually the one who got rich. We will start at the bottom, where you would most likely have stood, with the prospector and his impossible odds, and we will climb slowly upward through every level of that machine. We will meet the merchants who sold flour at prices that seem almost invented. We will climb the wall of ice in the far north, where you had to carry a literal ton of goods on your back before they would even let you near the gold. We will sit in the warm noise of the saloons and the gambling halls where the day's takings ended up, no matter who won or lost in the creeks. We will meet the quiet, careful assayer who alone could tell you what your gold was truly worth, and the bankers who grew immense by simply moving and guarding other men's dust. We will meet the women who ran boarding houses and out-earned every miner in town, and we will follow the money all the way up to the men who bought whole towns, and all the way through to the end, to the bust, to the empty streets and the ghost towns, and to the final, quiet question of who actually walked away rich and whether they even managed to keep it. But all of that is still ahead of us, waiting in the dark like a long road we'll walk together slowly. For now, just stay here at the beginning, at the water's edge, where it all started. Stay with the hundreds of thousands of hopeful people pouring toward a jar of coins that was already nearly empty. Stay with the brief, shining window of early 1848, when the gold was real and the fortunes were real, the window that closed almost as soon as it opened, and yet pulled the whole world after it for years. Stay with the long, cold odds of the Klondike, 100,000 setting out and a few hundred striking it rich. There is something in those numbers, isn't there? Something that softens as you turn it over. All that hope, all those people, each one certain that they would be the lucky one, that they would be the exception, that the legend would come true for them. And it almost never did. The gold rush was, more than anything, a vast machine for turning the hope of the many into the wealth of the few. And the few, almost always, were not the ones doing the digging. Tomorrow, or rather a little further into tonight, we will follow that money where it actually went. We will leave the cold water and the empty pan behind, and we will climb to the next level of the pyramid, up to the merchant standing behind his counter, watching the hopeful crowds pour in, knowing that whether they found gold or not, they would all have to come to him first. We will learn what an egg cost in a boomtown and why a pinch of salt could be worth its weight in gold. We will meet the man who clothed the miners and founded a company that outlived every single mine. But that is for the climb ahead. For now, let the water run quietly in the dark. Let the lamp burn low. The diggers are kneeling at the streams hoping. The merchant is counting his stock. And the truth of where the gold really went is just beginning to come clear, slowly, the way the best truths do, in a calm and patient voice, while you rest. So stay with me a moment longer at the water's edge before we climb. Feel the cold of the stream around your hands, the weight of the pan, the ache that comes from kneeling too long in one place. This was the work. Hour after hour of it, day after day, lifting gravel, swirling water, watching for the smallest glint of color in the muck, and finding, most days, almost nothing. A few flecks, a little dust. Enough, perhaps, to keep you here another week, chasing the same shrinking promise. And all around you in those crowded camps were thousands of others doing exactly the same thing. Men who had been farmers and clerks and sailors and shopkeepers, who had left whole lives behind to be here, bent over the same water, reaching into the same nearly empty jar. Some of them would last a season. Some would last a year. A very few would find enough to feel for one bright moment that the legend had come true for them, and most would eventually stand up, look at their worn-out hands and their empty poke, and understand at last that the math had been against them from the very first day. That understanding, when it came, must have been a heavy thing, to have believed so completely, to have given up so much, and to discover that the door had been closing even as you ran toward it. But there is no need to feel the weight of it now, not tonight. We are only visiting. We can stand at the water's edge and watch with kindness, and then turn and walk on up the hill toward the warm windows of the town, toward the next level of the story, where the real money was quietly piling up. Let the numbers drift through you one more time, gently, like the last of the daylight leaving the room. Most 49ers earned only a laborer's wage, if that. The easy gold was largely gone by 1852. A fixed jar of gold divided among an exploding crowd. A brief, real, dazzling window in early 1848, hundreds of dollars a day for the first few, the bait that drew the millions. And far to the north and years later, the same story told again in ice. 100,000 setting out for the Klondike, 30 or 40,000 reaching Dawson, a few hundred growing rich, the claims already gone before most ever arrived. That is the foundation. That is the ground floor of the whole great machine. And from here, the only way is up, level by level, into the strange and quiet truth of who really got rich and how, while the diggers knelt in the cold below. Rest now and let the story carry you. There is so much more to come, and all the time in the world to tell it. The merchant is waiting at the top of the hill behind his counter with his shelves full of picks and pans and flour, watching the hopeful crowd come up out of the streams toward him. And we will go to meet him, slowly, in just a little while. But before we climb that hill, sit with the man at the top of it for a moment, because his story is the key that turns the whole lock. His name was Samuel Brannan, and he was a merchant in San Francisco when the gold was found. And what he did with that knowledge tells you everything you need to know about how fortunes were really made. He heard about the gold before almost anyone else, and here is the thing that separates him from the 100,000 who would soon come pouring in. He did not run for the river. He did not buy a pan and a mule and a dream. He did something far quieter and far cleverer. He went through the streets of San Francisco and he bought up every pick, every shovel, every pan he could lay his hands on. He cornered the supply. He made himself the only door the gold could be reached through, and only then, with his shelves full and his rivals empty, did he run out into those same streets, holding a bottle of gold dust above his head, shouting that gold had been found on the American river. Picture it. The cry goes up, the town empties toward the water, and every single one of those hopeful men needs a pan. And there is only one place to buy one. A tin pan that had cost him 20 cents, he sold for $15. $15 for a thing worth 20 cents because he had made it the one thing standing between a man and his fortune. He is remembered as California's first millionaire, and let that fact settle all the way down to the bottom of you tonight. The first man to grow truly rich from the California gold rush never once knelt in a cold stream. He never swirled gravel in a pan. He never broke his back in the diggings. He got rich by selling the dream to the men who did. This is the whole secret, said plainly at the very start. There is a phrase for it, and once you have heard it, you will see it on every level of the town, in every shop window, behind every counter, and every bar. Mining the miners. The real gold was never in the ground at all. The real gold was in the crowd, in their hope, in their hunger, in the money they carried in their pockets when they arrived and were so eager to spend. The Boomtown was not a place where men found wealth. It was a machine for moving wealth sideways and upward out of the hands of the many who dug and into the hands of the few who sold. And the man who understood that, the man who stood still and let the crowd run past him toward the water, he was the one who walked away wealthy while they walked away with empty hands and aching backs. So before we go any further into this strange and quiet country of the gold rush, let me ask you something softly, the way you ask a question of someone half asleep who may or may not answer. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I am always curious who is out there in the dark with me, in what far corner of the world your window is, what hour it is, where you are. And if you are new here, if you have only just found your way to this slow and careful kind of story, there is a small button that says subscribe, and pressing it means more nights like this one will find their way to you. That is all. No hurry. You can do it now or never. The story will go on either way. Now, let the merchant fade for a moment back behind his counter, and let us go back down the hill one last time to the men at the water, because we owe them an honest look before we leave them behind. We have to understand exactly how the trap was built, how the bait was set, because the cruelty of it is also the genius of it. It begins with a true thing. That is what makes it work. In the very earliest days, at the start of 1848, before the news had spread, before the masses had even heard the word gold, the first few men at the rivers really did pull fortunes out of the water. Hundreds of dollars in a single day. It was real. It was not a lie. A handful of men in the right place at the right moment, in that brief, shining window, took out more gold than a working man back east might see in years. And that true and dazzling thing was the bait. Because the stories of those first lucky few traveled, and they grew in the telling, and they did not carry with them the small print, the part that mattered most. The part that mattered most was this: gold near the surface, the loose gold a man can wash out of a stream bed with a pan, what they called placer gold, is finite. There is only so much of it. Picture a single jar of gold dust sitting at the bottom of a river. In early 1848, a few dozen men share that jar between them, and each man's share is enormous, but the news spreads, and 100 men come, and the jar is the same size. Then 1,000, then tens of thousands. The same jar divided among an ever-swelling crowd, and every new arrival makes every share smaller. The math is merciless, and it is the same in every gold rush that ever was. A fixed amount of easy gold divided by an exploding population, and the answer gets closer and closer to nothing with every ship that lands. So by 1852, only a few short years after it all began, the easy surface gold in California was largely worked out. The dream that had pulled them across oceans and deserts was, by the time most of them arrived, already mostly gone. And what was the average man left with? At best, if he was lucky and worked hard, something close to a laborer's wage. The same money he might have made swinging a hammer back home, only now he was paying Boomtown prices for everything, kneeling in freezing water, far from anyone who loved him. And this is where you need to hold two things in your mind at once. The prospector's story, the one that spread across every port and parlor and newspaper in the world, was built on a real thing. The gold was real. The fortunes of those earliest arrivals were real. But the story was like a map with the most dangerous part left blank. And the blank part was this: while thousands of men were learning, slowly and painfully, that the jar was nearly empty, a small number of other men were getting extraordinarily rich. Not from what was in the jar, from the jar itself. From the pan. Samuel Brannan was not a miner. He had come to California before the rush as a merchant and a newspaper publisher, and when word reached him in the spring of 1848 that gold had been found at Sutter's Mill on the American River, his first thought was not to pick up a shovel. His first thought was considerably more interesting than that. Before he said a word to anyone, before he breathed a syllable of news to the public, he went quietly and methodically around San Francisco and the surrounding settlements, and he bought every pan, every pick, every shovel he could lay his hands on. He cleaned out the hardware, he swept the shelves. He bought up the entire visible supply of the tools a man would need to go and dig for gold, and he paid the going price for them, which was very low, because nobody yet knew they were going to need them in any great number. And then he ran through the streets of San Francisco holding a bottle of gold dust over his head, shouting that gold had been found on the American River. A pan that had cost him somewhere around 20 cents, he then sold from his store for as much as $15. The price had multiplied by 75, and people paid it gladly, because what was $15 when there was a fortune in the ground just a few days' travel away? Samuel Brannan is widely described as California's first millionaire, and he made every cent of it without once putting a pan in the water. He understood before almost anyone else that the money was not in the ground. The money was in the people going to dig. What he had seen, and what almost everyone else had missed, was that a gold rush creates two kinds of hunger. There is the hunger for gold, which is powerful and romantic and almost impossible to satisfy. And there is the hunger for the things you need to chase gold, which is just as powerful and considerably easier to supply if you have had the foresight to corner the market first. Brannan cornered the market. He saw a wave coming, and instead of riding it, he built a wall and charged the wave to pass through. It sounds almost too neat, too perfectly observed, but the pattern holds, and it holds across the decades, and across the continent, and it holds for far more than pans and shovels. Think about what a man needs the moment he decides to chase gold. He needs tools, yes, but before the tools, before anything, he needs to eat. And he needs to eat not once, but every single day for weeks and months, in a place where ordinary supply chains do not reach, and where the population has just exploded in a matter of months, from almost nothing to something that strains every seam. The result is a kind of scarcity that produces prices most people in the settled East could not imagine, even having been told the numbers. In Gold Rush, California, eggs could reach roughly $1 each at the height of the supply crunch. A single egg. At a time when $1 represented a meaningful portion of a working man's daily wage back home, a single egg was $1. Flour, the most basic staple, the thing that kept men alive, spiked to multiples of its Eastern price, and it moved in violent lurches depending on when the last supply ship came in. Goods that were ordinary and cheap everywhere else in the world became extraordinary and expensive in the camps and in the growing city of San Francisco, simply because the distance was enormous, the roads were non-existent, and the demand was ferocious. And then carry that picture north and forward in time almost 50 years to the Klondike in the late 1890s, and you find the same logic playing out in even more extreme conditions because the geography is even more punishing. Dawson City in the Yukon Territory sat at the end of one of the most formidable supply lines the 19th century had ever attempted to thread. Getting goods there required crossing hundreds of miles of wilderness, navigating dangerous rivers, and, at the narrowest point, climbing a mountain. In Dawson, salt could quite literally be worth its weight in gold. A single fresh egg, at the worst moments of scarcity, could cost a small fortune. A fresh apple, something a man might eat without a second thought sitting at a kitchen table in Ohio or Ontario, was a luxury almost beyond price. Not because anyone was hoarding, not because the merchants were unusually cruel, but because moving anything to Dawson City was a staggering logistical undertaking, and the cost of that undertaking had to be paid by someone, and the someone who paid it was the man at the end of the chain with gold dust in his pocket and nothing else around him to spend it on. The price of an egg in Dawson City is not a curiosity. It is the whole story of the Boomtown economy compressed into a single shell. Distance plus scarcity plus captive demand equals whatever price the seller can name, and the man with the gold has no alternative but to pay it. Every dollar that left the ground in those northern creeks had to pass through the hands of someone selling food, tools, shelter, or warmth before it could go anywhere else. The merchant did not need to find the gold. He just needed to be standing between the gold and everything the miner wanted to buy with it. Now hold that egg in your mind and follow it forward, because there is a version of this story that did not stay in a single boomtown and did not stay in a single decade. There is a version of this story that you are still living inside right now. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853, not as a miner, but as a dry goods merchant, the younger brother of a family business operation, come to set up a West Coast outpost selling the kind of practical goods that a swelling working city needed. He was not the first person to sell cloth to miners. He was not even selling anything particularly exotic. What he was doing was paying very close attention to what the men who came through his door actually needed, which turned out to be something slightly different from what they were asking for. Miners wore through their clothes at a punishing rate. The work was rough on fabric in ways that ordinary commercial garments were not built to withstand. And the problem was not just the wear itself, but where the wear happened, at the corners of pockets and at the stress points of seams, the places where a man reached for his tools or knelt on gravel or caught the edge of a rock. The clothes came apart at the joints. A tailor in Reno named Jacob Davis had found a solution to this. He had begun reinforcing the critical stress points of work trousers with small copper rivets the kind of industrial fastener you might use in a harness or a strap, driving them through the fabric at the pocket corners and the button fly. The rivets held the cloth together where the cloth most wanted to come apart. It was such a simple idea that it is almost embarrassing in retrospect. Rivet the corners. That is the whole innovation. But Jacob Davis did not have the money to patent the idea himself, and he knew that if he did not patent it, someone else would eventually copy it, and he would have nothing to show for it. So he wrote to Levi Strauss, his fabric supplier in San Francisco, and proposed that they apply for the patent together. Strauss agreed. On May 20th, 1873, United States Patent number 139-121 was granted to Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis for the riveted work trouser. They began manufacturing them in San Francisco almost immediately. The company that grew from that patent is still operating today. The mines that those trousers were made for are all closed. The rivers they waded in have long since stopped giving up placer gold. The men who wore the first pair of Levi's are bones in the California earth, but the company that clothed them outlasted every mine, outlasted every claim, outlasted the rush itself by a century and more, and counting. The man who came to sell cloth to miners founded something that the miners themselves could not have imagined would be there long after they were gone. Levi Strauss never needed a pan, and he was not alone in seeing what the supply side of a gold rush could become. Philip Armour, a young man from New York, had made his way to California during the rush and had worked not as a miner but as a butcher, provisioning the camps with meat, supplying the steady and utterly reliable hunger of men who needed feeding regardless of how their claims were doing that week. The meat business did not have the romance of the gold business. Nobody told heroic stories about the butcher the way they told stories about the prospector. But the butcher got paid every day in hard cash by men who had no choice but to eat. The capital that Armour built in California provisioning work went with him when he eventually left the diggings and moved eastward, and the small, early fortune he made feeding miners became the seed money for what would eventually grow into Armour and Company, one of the dominant meatpacking operations in the American Midwest. His name was on the label of the tinned goods that stocked larders across the country, not because he had struck gold in a California riverbed, but because he had understood that a gold rush needs groceries, the provisioner, the dry goods merchant, the man selling the pan. The first three levels of a structure that was building itself from the bottom up, transferring money from the hands of the people actually digging to the hands of the people standing just behind them with something to sell. But to understand the fullest version of this transfer, you need to go back to the mountain. Because before a man in the Klondike Rush could spend any money in Dawson City, before he could buy an egg or a drink or a new pair of trousers, he had to get there. And getting there was a problem that required, among other things, a ton. Not a figurative ton, a literal ton. Approximately 1,000 pounds of goods. The Northwest Mounted Police had been posted at the summits of the mountain passes into Canadian territory, and their order was stark and simple and had the force of law behind it. Before you cross into Canada, you must show us that you are carrying enough food and supplies to survive for approximately 1 year on your own. If you cannot show us that, you turn around. The rule had been put in place because the Canadian authorities had watched the early Klondike arrivals stumble into the territory half-starved and desperately unprepared, and they had made a decision, a humane and slightly terrifying one, that no one would pass the checkpoint at the top of the Chilkoot Pass without sufficient supplies to survive what was waiting on the other side. The required outfit weighed somewhere around 1,000 pounds. Food, tools, clothing, medicines, equipment for building and cooking, and surviving the Yukon winter. 1,000 pounds for one man. And the pass itself, the Chilkoot Pass, was not a road, it was a mountain. At its steepest section near the summit, the stampeders had cut steps directly into the packed snow and ice, a long, brutal staircase rising at a punishing angle into the clouds. They called them the Golden Stairs, and the name had a dark irony to it because the only gold in those stairs was the gold you were hoping to find on the other side. A man could not carry 1,000 pounds in one trip. Nobody could. And so the stampeders did something that most of us have never had to do, and hopefully never will. They carried their ton up the mountain in relays, a back-breaking load at a time, sometimes 30, 40, 50 pounds per trip, climbing the Golden Stairs and depositing their load at the top, then descending to carry more. Again and again. Some men made the trip over the pass dozens of times before they had moved their entire outfit to the other side. Eyewitness accounts describe a line of men stretching up the face of the mountain, a slow, bowed, wordless chain of human labor carrying their futures up out of the world they knew and into the unknown one above. If you stood at the bottom and looked up, you did not see a gold rush. You saw something that looked like punishment. But here is where the ton of goods stops being just a story of hardship and becomes a story about money, specifically about where the money went before anyone ever reached the mountain. Because the rule required a ton of goods, and a ton of goods had to be bought somewhere. And the somewhere was not the wilderness. The somewhere was a town, several towns in fact. Seattle in the state of Washington had positioned itself aggressively as the gateway to the Klondike. When news of the gold strike reached the outside world in the summer of 1897, the city's merchants understood immediately what was going to happen, and Seattle's boosters and business community moved with remarkable speed to make sure that the outfitting happened on their streets. Every man headed for the Klondike needed his ton of goods. Every man needed it before he could pass the checkpoint at the Chilkoot, and Seattle's merchants were ready to sell him every pound of it. The economic impact on Seattle was enormous and nearly immediate. Hardware stores, clothing merchants, food suppliers, and outfitters of every description found themselves serving a seemingly endless queue of stampeders, each one needing a complete outfit, each one willing to pay for speed and convenience because the season was short and the journey was long and the gold, everyone believed, was waiting. The city had been in a period of economic depression before the rush. The Klondike transformed it. Further north, the towns of Skagway and Dyer, sitting at the foot of the mountain passes, were themselves miniature boomtowns of a very specific and profitable kind. They existed to extract the last of a stampeder's non-essential spending before the hard part began. Hotels, saloons, outfitters who sold the things you had forgotten or the things that had broken on the journey north. Skagway in particular was a town of extraordinary chaos and extraordinary commerce, a place where an entire economy had materialized in a matter of weeks out of a collection of tents and planks, and where the primary industry was separating the stampeder from whatever money he still had after buying his ton. Some of that separation was voluntary, some of it was not. Skagway, during the height of the rush, had a reputation for confidence men, card sharps, and outright thieves that was well earned and widely reported. But even the legitimate commerce was formidable. By the time a man had bought his outfit in Seattle, paid his passage to Skagway, spent a few days eating and sleeping and replacing broken gear in those northern supply towns, and then paid to have his ton of goods freighted partway up the mountain by the men who had set up pack horse and eventually aerial tramway services for exactly that purpose, he had already spent a substantial sum, and he had not yet found a single flake of gold. The outfitting economy was itself a gold mine, and it required no panning at all. It required only a location at the choke point between the dreamer and the dream, and a supply of whatever the dreamer needed to pass through. Hold that image of the choke point because you will see it again at every level of the pyramid. The Boomtown economy was not an open field where everyone competed equally. It was a series of narrow gates, and the people who got rich were almost always the ones who had positioned themselves at a gate before the crowd arrived. Brannan had his gate at the hardware store, the Seattle merchants had their gate at the outfitting depot, the provisioners at Skagway and Dyer had their gate at the foot of the mountain, and the Northwest Mounted Police at the top of the Chilkoot had their gate of a different kind, one that was not about commerce at all, but that created, simply by existing, an enormous commercial opportunity for everyone standing below it. A ton of goods, bought, carried and paid for before a single claim was staked. The mountain extracted the price of admission and the towns at the base collected it. Now think about what all of those stampeders needed on the long journey before they even reached Seattle. Think about the ships. Think about the rail lines. Think about the food that had to come from somewhere, the equipment that had to be manufactured somewhere, the transport that had to be operated by someone. A gold rush does not exist in isolation. It creates a supply chain that stretches backward from the mountain pass to the port city, to the manufacturing town, to the farm, and every link in that chain is a business, and every business takes a share. The man in the pan, the man kneeling in the icy water at the end of all of that chain, was the final destination of a great extraction. Not the source of it, the destination. He arrived having already paid for the ship and the outfitter and the freighter. He would go on to pay for the saloon and the gambling hall and the assayer and the bank and the landlord. And somewhere, far behind him and far above him, in the structure of the thing, the men who had positioned themselves at the gates had collected their share at every step of the journey in a quiet and systematic way that attracted far less attention than the man with the pan. Because the man with the pan was the story that everyone told. His image was the image that appeared on the posters and in the newspaper accounts and in the letters home. He was the romantic figure, the dreamer, the embodiment of the promise. And as long as that image held the world's attention, the men at the gates could go about their business in relative peace. Levi Strauss did not need the newspapers to write stories about him. His customers were the story. Samuel Brannan did not need anyone to talk about his hardware store. He just needed everyone to keep wanting shovels. Philip Armour did not need anyone to romanticize the butcher's trade. He just needed the miners to keep eating. And so the flow of money went from the man in the creek to the man at the gate, steadily and reliably and in enormous volume, regardless of whether any gold came up with the pan on any given day. The merchant did not share the miner's risk. He shared the miner's hunger, his thirst, his need for warmth and shelter and tools, and those things were as constant and as reliable as gravity. They did not fluctuate with the gold price. They did not depend on luck. They were simply there every single day, waiting to be met at whatever price the market would bear. And in a boomtown, the market would bear almost anything, which brings us back to that egg, $1. In the California camps, in the early frenzied years of the rush, the price of an egg was not a scandal. It was not something people marched in the streets about or wrote angry editorials over. It was simply the price, because there was nowhere else to go, because the alternative to paying $1 for an egg was not finding a cheaper egg somewhere nearby. The alternative was going hungry. And a man who is hungry cannot work his claim, and a man who cannot work his claim cannot find gold, and a man who cannot find gold has no reason to be there at all. The merchant understood this perfectly, even if he never articulated it. He did not need to be cruel to charge extraordinary prices. He only needed to understand that he was the last gate before the man in the creek got everything he needed to survive, and that last gate could be priced accordingly. In Dawson City, during the worst winters, this logic reached its most extreme expression. Fresh food was almost impossible to bring in once the passes closed and the rivers froze. What existed in Dawson when winter sealed the territory was what existed, and if it ran low, the prices that resulted were of a kind that most of us have no reference point for. Salt, the most ordinary mineral in the world, something you knock off a table without a thought, could approach the value of gold dust by weight in the worst moments of scarcity. An apple, a fresh apple, brought over the mountains before the freeze, was not a piece of fruit in Dawson City in winter. It was a small treasure, and it was priced accordingly. The men who had the salt and the apples were not cruel men. They were simply men who had the salt and the apples in a place where no one else did, and the price was whatever the market said. And the market, in a boomtown with no alternatives and a population that had no choice but to stay, said quite a lot. This is the arithmetic that the romantic image of the gold rush erases. The image shows the man in the creek, the sun on the water, the glint of possibility in the pan. It does not show the merchant watching from the dry bank, adding up his receipts. It does not show the long shadow of supply chains stretching back over the mountains. It does not show the price of the egg. But the egg was always there. And the man who owned the egg was always going to come out ahead of the man looking for gold in the water. Now follow the story of what Levi Strauss built just a little further, because the riveted trouser is not simply a detail in the history of the California gold rush. It is a way of understanding how the supply side of a rush creates durable, lasting wealth in a way that the gold itself almost never does. The mines of California, the ones that produced all the gold that pulled all those men across the Pacific and around Cape Horn and over the Sierra Nevada, are closed. The rivers have been quiet for generations. But the company that made the trousers that the miners wore while they worked those rivers is still making trousers. It is still operating more than 150 years later out of the same basic insight that Jacob Davis brought to Levi Strauss in a letter. The men who work with their hands need their clothes to hold together. The patent was granted in 1873, 20 years after the height of the California rush, but the roots of the company reach back to those first years in San Francisco, to the dry goods trade that brought Strauss to the West Coast, to the merchant instinct that said the market for supplying people who needed to work was more reliable than the market for gold. Strauss sold fabric to miners. Davis riveted the fabric. Together they made something that outlasted not just the rush, but several generations of rushes after it, because the thing they had made was not tied to any particular deposit of gold in any particular streambed. It was tied to the permanent and enduring fact that people do physical work, and physical work destroys clothes, and people will always need better clothes. The mine is finite, the trouser is not. That is the merchant's understanding of the world, and it is the understanding that separated the people who left a gold rush rich from the people who left broke. The man in the creek was betting on a specific deposit of gold being there when he reached his pan into the water. The man selling the trouser was betting on something that was going to be true regardless of what came up in the pan. One bet was narrow and specific and ran out. The other was broad and durable and did not. Philip Armour understood this. His provisioning work in California was not glamorous. There is no legend of the brave butcher, no romantic account of the man with the cleaver, no equivalent of the 49ers' heroic image in popular memory. But the capital he accumulated feeding the camps traveled with him, and it compounded, and it turned into an empire of food processing that would eventually put his name on products sold across the continent. He had found in the California diggings something more valuable than gold. He had found the proof that feeding people was a business that never ran out of customers. The supply chain goes up the mountain, and it also goes back into time, back to the moment before any of these men loaded a ship or packed a mule, back to the decision about how to use the rush rather than chase it. Brannan made that decision with hardware, Strauss made it with fabric, Armour made it with meat. Each of them looked at the same gold rush and saw not the gold at the end of it, but the need that was going to pull 100,000 people toward that gold, hungry and cold and equipped with whatever they had managed to carry. And each of them positioned himself at the gate at the foot of the mountain, the gate at the store in San Francisco, the gate at the outfitting depot in Seattle, where a city that had been struggling and uncertain suddenly found itself the last stop before the dream and priced itself accordingly. Seattle's transformation in the summer of 1897 was not accidental. The city's merchants and civic boosters understood that the Klondike Rush needed a gateway, and they made sure through aggressive advertising and competitive pricing and a deliberate effort to make the city the obvious starting point for any stampeder on the West Coast, that Seattle was that gateway. When the steamer Portland pulled into Seattle's dock in July of 1897 carrying 2 tons of gold from the Klondike, the city's newspapers reported it with a specific kind of calculation, understanding that the real gold for Seattle was not on the ship. The real gold was the stampede that was about to begin, and all the outfitting business that came with it. The depression that had been grinding Seattle down lifted almost overnight. The hardware stores hired more staff, the food suppliers expanded their operations, the clothing merchants brought in new stock. Skagway and Deer, sitting at the feet of the passes, materialized out of almost nothing and grew to thousands of people in a matter of weeks, because they sat at the last gate before the mountain, and the mountain required a ton to pass. A ton bought in Seattle, a ton carried up the golden stairs in relay after grueling relay by men who had paid for every pound of it and would go on to pay for every meal and every night's lodging on the far side. And waiting at the top, not with a collecting tin, but with something considerably more effective, the Northwest Mounted Police making sure that the gate remained a gate, that the rule held, that the ton was presented, that the ticket was validated before passage was granted. They were not merchants, they were law enforcement. But the effect of their presence was to guarantee the market for the men selling the ton, because without the ton you could not pass, and without passing you could not mine, and the only way to get the ton was to buy it. From someone, from the men at the gate. The man arriving in Seattle or Skagway with his savings, his hope, his determination, had already begun paying the price of admission before he knew that was what he was doing. He was paying it in hardware stores and at ship ticket counters and in the outfitting depots along the waterfront. He was paying it in the small fees and the large prices and the ordinary transactions that were not extraordinary to anyone on the selling side, because the selling side had simply looked at a crowd of people who needed things and supplied those things at the price the crowd would bear. That is the Boomtown economy, stripped to its bones. A crowd arrives needing everything in a place that has almost nothing. Someone has thought to bring the things the crowd needs, or position themselves to be between the crowd and those things, and that someone names a price that the crowd, having no alternative, pays. The money flows from the crowd to the supplier reliably and continuously, regardless of whether anyone in the crowd finds what they came for. The crowd is looking for gold. The supplier already found it. The supplier found it the moment the crowd showed up. This is what Brannan saw running through the streets of San Francisco with his bottle of gold dust. He was not celebrating the discovery of gold. He was celebrating the discovery of a much more reliable kind of wealth, the kind that does not require you to kneel in a cold river and hope. He was celebrating the moment he understood that the man selling the pan to the man looking for gold was going to get very, very rich. And so he did. And behind him, following his example in one form or another across decades and across a continent, came Strauss with his fabric and his rivets, and Armour with his cleaver and his careful accounting, and the merchants of Seattle measuring their counter space and ordering new stock, and the outfitters of Skagway and Dyer watching the line of stampeders come off the ships and calculating the price of a pound of salt against the cost of bringing it over the passes. All of them at the gate, all of them collecting the toll. The prospector paid it on the way in, at the hardware store, and the outfitter and the ship. He would go on to pay it every day he was there for food and shelter and the warmth of a fire. And when the gold was gone and the camps were quiet and the rush had moved somewhere else, the merchants would count what they had taken and find, most of them, that the gate had been very good to them indeed, far better than the pan. The saloon came before almost everything else, before the assayer's office, before the bank, before the church, before the school, before anything that might be called civic order settled into a boomtown and took root. The saloon was already there. It arrived with the crowd, or slightly ahead of it, carried in on the same tide of optimism and motion that moved the stampeders over the mountains and down the rivers. You could say the saloon was the first true institution of the Boomtown economy because it understood something fundamental about what men do when they are tired and cold and a long way from home. They spend money, not carefully, not with the measured deliberation of someone planning for the future. They spend it the way men spend money when they have worked hard and the future feels very far away, and the evening is right in front of them, warm and loud and smelling of whiskey and sawdust and whatever the cook has going in the back room. They spend it the way people spend money when the whole point of being here is a gamble already, when the act of crossing a continent or an ocean on the strength of a rumor has loosened something in the ordinary machinery of caution. The saloon knew this. The saloon had been built around this knowledge. What the merchants captured on the way in, the saloons and gambling halls captured in the evenings. And the crucial difference was this. The merchant took a miner's money once when the miner outfitted himself and had to wait for the next fresh arrival to do it again. The saloon took money from the same men night after night for as long as there were men in the camp. It was a recurring transaction, not a one-time toll. It was the difference between a gate and a river, and the river, as it turned out, ran deep. A man could dig all day in icy water, finding almost nothing, and still walk into the saloon that evening with dust in his poke and something approaching hope. The strange economy of the Boomtown made this almost inevitable, because the alternative, in a place where there was nowhere comfortable to sit and nothing familiar to do, and the nights were long and the cold was serious, was to sit alone in a tent thinking about how far you were from everything you knew. The saloon was expensive, but loneliness was its own kind of cost, and the saloon at least gave you something back for what you paid. Warmth, noise, the feeling of other human bodies in the room, the possibility, however remote, that tonight might be the night something good happened. The gambling hall leaned into that possibility with particular skill. The games were structured as gambling games have always been structured, so that the house collected a margin on every hand, every roll, every spin. The odds were never equal, they were not meant to be. But the genius of the gambling hall was that it did not need to cheat, or at least not always, not clumsily, because the mathematics were already on its side, and all it had to do was keep the tables running long enough for those mathematics to accumulate into profit. One miner might win handsomely, spectacularly, in a fashion that would be talked about for weeks. And that winning was not a problem for the house. That winning was an advertisement. The miner who walked out with more than he came in with was the story that brought 3 more men through the door the following night, each of them carrying the private belief that they too might be the one. They were almost never the one, but they each paid for the chance, and the house collected those payments steadily every evening, whether the creeks were running yellow or whether the diggings had gone quiet and the season was pulling toward winter. The saloon and the gambling hall captured miners' cash with a beautiful independence from the actual state of the gold. A poor season in the diggings still produced a full house at the faro table. A played-out claim still sent its owner to the bar. The revenue was not correlated with the luck of the strike. It was correlated only with the presence of men who had been hoping very hard all day and needed somewhere to put that hope down for a few hours. That is a very stable business model. In Dawson City, at the height of the Klondike rush, the dance halls and saloons operated at a scale that matched the extraordinary character of the place itself. The entertainers who worked those stages were not suffering through hard times. A performer in Dawson who could sing or dance or simply stand and be agreeable company was in possession of something the camp wanted badly, which is to say, something female and warm and alive in a world that was overwhelmingly male and cold and exhausted. The tips came in gold dust. They came in nuggets. A good evening on the floor of a Dawson dance hall could produce more wealth than a week on a mediocre claim, and it did so without frostbite and without the particular despair of kneeling in frozen gravel and coming up with nothing. The performers understood this arithmetic. The smarter ones were not merely earning, they were accumulating carefully, the way you accumulate something you intend to take with you when the crowd moves on. And there was another source of wealth in the saloon that was so particular to its time and place that it deserves a moment of quiet attention. The sweepings. Gold dust used as currency in the camps and halls was a physical substance and therefore subject to the laws of physical substances. It moved, it fell, it scattered. In any busy saloon where dozens of miners paid for drinks and games with pinches of dust poured from small leather pouches, a portion of that dust would miss the scale, miss the cup, drift in a wayward current of barroom air and settle somewhere else. Onto the counter, into the cracks between the floorboards, under the legs of the chairs, on the coats of the men who bumped each other passing through a door. The proprietors knew this. They planned for it. At the end of a long evening's operation, the floors of Dawson's saloons were swept with deliberate care. The sweepings were collected and processed. The gold that had fallen out of transactions, not stolen, not cheated, simply lost in the ordinary physical chaos of a busy room, was real gold, and it added up. In a place where a single grain of dust had value, a floor full of scattered grains was not nothing. The sweepings of a busy Dawson saloon represented a kind of passive income, an almost accidental harvest of wealth that fell to the house as a side effect of all those hands reaching across the bar. The miners were paying in a very literal sense just by being in the room. You might lie awake in this city, deep in the Yukon night, and hear music drifting from the direction of the saloon 2 streets away and feel something complicated. If you had been out on a claim all day, in the cold, in the hard, particular cold of the Klondike that settles into the muscles and stays there, you might feel that the music was calling to you, offering something simple and human in exchange for the gold dust in your poke, and it was offering exactly that. The question was only whether you could afford to answer it every night, and whether the men who owned the music could afford to let you keep some of what you dug. They could afford it very well, because every night you came in, something went to them that never went back. But even the saloon, that perfect machine for converting hope and loneliness into revenue, was not the whole picture. There was another figure in the Boomtown economy who has received less of the romantic treatment, perhaps because his work involved neither the drama of the digger nor the theatrics of the gambler, but who stood at a point so central to the whole operation that nothing moved without him. The assayer. You have to understand the particular problem that gold dust created when it circulated as money, which it did throughout the mining camps in the absence of anything more reliable. Gold is gold, but gold dust is not quite the same thing as gold in a simple bar. Gold dust can be mixed, it can be shaved, meaning The scales can be gently managed to short a transaction. It can be adulterated with fine brass filings which look very much like gold dust under ordinary lighting, or with fine grains of sand of the right color. A man receiving payment in gold dust was receiving something he could not easily verify on the spot, and the history of the camps is full of quiet stories about dust that was not quite what it was claimed to be. This problem was not abstract, it was daily. It was every transaction, every meal, every night's lodging, every hand of cards. The uncertainty that ran through the currency ran through the entire local economy like a hairline crack through a foundation. The assayer was the man who could tell you the truth. He had instruments, scales of genuine precision, acids that reacted to gold in specific and measurable ways, knowledge built through training and practice. And what he offered was a certification. Your dust came in, your dust was weighed and tested, and what came back was a number with authority behind it, not a hope, not an estimate from a man who might be cheating you. A number. In the economy of a mining town, that certification was one of the most valuable things you could buy. Not because the assayer made anyone rich, but because he made it possible to know, with something approaching certainty, what you already had. He was the gatekeeper of value in the most literal sense. Your gold was worth, in the local economy, exactly what the assayer said it was worth. No more. His word was the foundation on which every other transaction in the camp rested, and a town without a reliable assayer was a town where every transaction was also a small gamble. The assayer did not need to find gold. He needed to know what gold was and to be trusted and to show up to work in the morning. Those were not small things in that world. They were, in their quiet way, the things that made the economy function. And the problem of adulterated and unreliable gold dust growing as the camps grew and more hands passed through the same pouches pointed towards something larger, the need for a mint. In 1854, the United States Mint opened a branch in San Francisco. The timing was not coincidental. California had been pouring gold out of its rivers and hills for 6 years by then, and the chaos of a currency system built on unverified dust had become a serious obstacle to the kind of commerce that a real city, which San Francisco was rapidly becoming, needed to conduct. The mint was the institutional answer to the assayer's problem, scaled up. It took raw gold in and produced standardized coins out, coins of known weight and purity, carrying the authority of the federal government rather than the authority of a single man with a set of scales. The miners had dug the gold. The mint turned it into money the economy could actually use. The men who built the mint, who staffed it, who ran the machinery of standardization, were not miners. They were a different kind of professional entirely, the kind who understood that wealth requires a container, and that the people who build the containers reliably outlast the people who fill them. But if the mint was the answer to the problem of currency at the level of coins and ingots, there was a parallel problem operating at a larger scale. How did you move gold? How did you get it from the camp where it was dug to the city where it could be spent? How did you keep it safe in the months or years between the finding and the spending, when the roads were rough and the camps were not exactly full of institutions you would trust with your life savings? This was the problem that Henry Wells and William Fargo saw in 1852 and decided to solve. Wells, Fargo and Company was not a mining company. It never needed to be. It was an express company and a bank founded to do two things: to move gold and money through the chaos of the California economy and to hold it safely while it was not moving. Wells and Fargo never needed a pan. They needed wagons and strong boxes and armed riders, and a reputation for reliability that they built carefully and defended aggressively, because in the business they were in, reputation was the entire product. Think about what that business looked like from the inside. Every day, in every camp and every town the company touched, men were handing over gold, real gold, the actual substance they had spent months and years and every ounce of their physical endurance trying to accumulate, and trusting Wells, Fargo and Company to carry it somewhere and deliver it intact. That trust was purchased at a price, a commission, a fee, and the fee was paid on every shipment by every miner, whether the gold had come easily or at terrible cost, whether the season had been good or punishing. Wells and Fargo did not care whether the season was good or punishing. They cared whether the gold existed and needed moving. It always did. The mining camps generated gold regardless of whether any individual miner was prospering. The aggregate kept flowing, and every ounce of it on its way out of the camp and into the economy of San Francisco, and eventually the economy of the wider country, passed through the company's strong boxes and contributed its small commission to the building of what would become one of the great financial institutions of American history. Henry Wells never knelt in a river. William Fargo never worked a claim. They looked at the river and saw not the gold in it, but the problem of moving the gold, and they built a solution to that problem that collected a percentage of everything continuously for as long as the rush lasted and well beyond it. Pierre Berton, writing about the Klondike, and H.W. Brands, writing about California, both circle back to the same structural observation. The men who built the infrastructure of the rush, the transportation, the finance, the communications, outlasted the rush itself because the infrastructure they built served whatever economic activity came next. The miner's claim was tied to a specific deposit of a specific resource in a specific place. The infrastructure was general purpose. When the gold ran out, the miners left. Wells Fargo stayed, and what Wells, Fargo and Company became is in some ways the cleanest illustration of the thesis that runs through this whole story, that the durable fortunes of the gold rush were built not on finding gold, but on serving the people who were looking for it. The company moved their gold, kept their gold, lent against their gold, and took a piece of it at every step. And when those particular miners were gone, it did the same for the next wave of economic activity, and the next, building on the foundation laid during the rush, but not dependent on the gold continuing. Brannan made his money in a single brilliant move, buying up the supply and selling into the demand he then created. Wells and Fargo built something more patient, more durable, a system designed to function as long as there was commerce to move through it. Both understood the same thing. The mining of the miners was more reliable than the mining of the ground. But Wells and Fargo turned that understanding into an institution. There is a detail about the Klondike Gold Rush reported by Pierre Berton in his account of those years that lodges in the mind because of what it says about the flow of money through a mining economy. By the time most of the stampeders who had left their homes in 1897 and 1898 actually reached Dawson City, having crossed the ocean and the passes and the lakes and the rivers, the good claims were already gone. They had been staked weeks or months earlier by men who were already in the Yukon when the news broke, men who did not need to travel 10,000 miles because they were already there, already on the ground, already holding their stakes. The stampeders arrived to find the door closed. They could still look for gold. There was still ground that hadn't been turned over, still claims available, still the possibility that something had been missed. But the great early returns, the kind that made the stories that drove the rush, were already in someone else's hands. The latecomer, which is to say almost everyone, was working the margins, and yet they had still paid, at every step of the journey, for the privilege of arriving too late. They had bought their outfits in Seattle and Skagway and Dyer. They had paid the freight on a ton of goods over the Chilkoot. They had purchased their food at Dawson prices, prices that, as we have established, bore no resemblance to the prices in the world they had left behind. Every dollar they had spent on the way in had gone somewhere, to someone who was building a fortune off the aggregate of those payments regardless of what the individual payer found when he got there. The money moved steadily and in one direction, from the people looking for gold to the people who had already found a different way to profit from the looking. Now hold that picture in your mind for a moment, that long directional flow of money through the Boomtown economy, and consider what it must have looked like from the position of the Central Pacific Railroad's principal backers, the four men who became known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. There is an open loop that was placed earlier in this story, a question about a university in California whose money started in a hardware store, and this is where that loop closes. Because before Leland Stanford was the governor of California, before he was the builder of the Transcontinental Railroad, before he was the founder of the institution that bears his son's name, he was a merchant. He was a Sacramento shopkeeper selling goods to miners, hardware, provisions, the tools and supplies of a life organized around extracting gold from California's rivers and hills. Stanford's early wealth, the seed capital that eventually funded a railroad and endowed a university, did not come from a mine, it came from a store. The same is true in various configurations of Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. These were not the romantic figures of the gold rush, not the lone 49ers with their pans and their mules and their stubborn belief in luck. They were the men on the supply side of the transaction, the men who understood, as Brannan had understood, that the demand for picks and shovels and flour and nails and boots did not depend on whether the gold panned out that day. The demand was created by the belief in gold, and the belief was self-sustaining. The men in the camps believed with tremendous force. They had to believe. They had already paid too much to stop believing. And that belief, channeled through the need to eat and sleep and work, produced a reliable daily expenditure that flowed into the ledgers of the men who sold them what they needed. Stanford moved from that store to the railroad, and the railroad was simply the same principle at a larger scale. The Transcontinental Railroad, which the Central Pacific began building from the California end in the 1860s, moved people and goods across the continent. It was infrastructure. It served whatever economic activity the country generated, mining and farming and manufacturing and everything else. The profits it produced were enormous, and they were durable because they were attached to movement itself rather than to the specific thing being moved. Stanford's university was endowed with that money. The professors who teach there today, the students who walk its stone corridors, the research that happens in its laboratories, all of it resting ultimately on the foundation of a Sacramento hardware store and the flow of miners through its doors in the years after 1848. The prospectors bought their shovels, the shovels bought a railroad, the railroad bought a university. It is the kind of chain that makes you sit with the story for a moment, because it is so different from the chain the prospector imagined when he outfitted himself and headed for the diggings. He imagined a chain that ran directly from his effort to his wealth, a clear line from the pan in his hand to the money in his pocket. And sometimes, very briefly at the very beginning, before the crowds arrived and the claims were all staked and the easy gold was gone, that chain was real. But the chains that lasted were always the sideways ones. The ones that ran not down into the ground but out across the surface of the economy, from the miner to the merchant, from the merchant to the banker, from the banker to the railroad, from the railroad to the land. Those were the chains that survived the bust. The assayer tested the gold and certified its value and collected his fee. The mint turned the dust into coins and made commerce possible and collected its margin. Wells, Fargo and Company moved the coins and guarded the gold and lent to the people who needed to borrow against it and collected its percentage. And the men who had started as merchants and ended as railroad barons collected the compound interest on 3 decades of selling to the people who were looking, the people who paid at the hardware store and then paid at the freight office and then paid at the ticket window of the railroad that those payments had helped to build. None of this was secret. The chain was not hidden. Anyone standing in Sacramento in 1849 could have seen what Brannan had already seen in San Francisco, that the man across the counter, the man measuring out the flour and pricing the nails, was in a better position than the man on the other side of the counter, the man about to leave for the diggings. But the pull of the story was very strong. The story said, "Out there, in the rivers and the hills, there is gold waiting to be found, and the man who finds it will be rich." That story had a clarity and a romance that the other story, the story about margins and markup and transport fees and compound interest, could not quite match. The other story was true. The other story was more reliably true. But it did not have the same pull on the imagination, did not produce the same quickening in the chest, did not send men over mountain passes in the dark. The story about the pan did all of those things, and so the men with the pans kept coming, and the men across the counter kept measuring, and the money kept moving in the same direction, and the Boomtown economy kept turning, that great machine for converting hope into revenue, running on the fuel of a story that was just true enough at the very beginning to sustain the belief for a very long time. The saloon was full every night. The gambling hall ran its numbers every evening. The assayer opened his office every morning. The express wagons moved out of camp on schedule, carrying strong boxes that belonged to Wells, Fargo and Company, headed for the city. And somewhere in Sacramento, a merchant who had once sold shovels was looking at the ledgers and thinking about what to do with what he had made, and what he was thinking about was a railroad. All of this was happening at once, in the same Boomtown, in the same economy, and the prospector in his tent at the edge of the diggings was part of it. Was, in fact, the part that made the whole thing run. Not because he found the gold, though sometimes he did find a little, but because he kept trying, because the belief sustained itself, fed by the rare and spectacular early success and the deep human reluctance to admit that you have crossed a continent for something that is not there. He was the engine. But the engine does not keep the profits. The profits go to the men who built the track. And so we come to the level of the Boomtown that the popular story almost never reaches. Not the man at the creek with his pan, not the merchant behind the counter, not the assayer with his scales, or the banker with his strongbox. We come now to the people who were everywhere in those camps, who were doing work that everyone needed done, whose labor the prospectors depended on for simple survival, and who, in many cases, walked away from the experience with more money than almost anyone else who had been there. We come to the women. The Boomtown was, at its earliest and most chaotic stage, a place that had been built almost entirely without domestic infrastructure. There were no hotels worth mentioning, no reliable laundries, no boarding houses that could handle the volume, no kitchens producing meals at scale. The men who flooded in from the eastern states, from Europe, from Chile and China and Australia, arrived into a world that had been stripped of the labor that ordinarily kept human beings fed and clothed and housed. That labor had always been done, in most of the places these men came from, by women. And now it was almost entirely absent. What happens to the price of something when it nearly disappears from the market is not complicated. It goes up considerably. A woman who could cook a meal in the California diggings in the early 1850s could name her price and expect to receive it. A woman who could run a boarding house, who could manage the supply of food and firewood and bedding, who could collect rents and keep accounts, was in possession of a business asset that was generating cash with a reliability that the men in the creek could barely imagine. They were out there in the cold water, shaking their pans, hoping. She was in the kitchen, filling plates, certain. Luzina Stanley Wilson arrived in California in 1849, traveling overland with her husband Mason and their 2 small children. Mason Wilson had come to mine. He was going to do what every man who crossed the plains was going to do. He was going to find the gold, and they were going to be wealthy. But Luzina Wilson looked at the camps around her and understood something that her husband, caught up in the gold-seeking current of the moment, did not immediately see. She saw hungry men. She wrote later in her memoirs, one of the few detailed first-person accounts left to us by a woman who lived through the rush, that she cooked her first meal in the diggings almost by accident. A miner approached her as she was making supper for her family, asking if he could eat with them and offering to pay. She charged him $5 for a biscuit and a plate of food. He paid without hesitation. She wrote that she looked at the coin in her hand and understood in that moment that she had found her mine. It was not underground. It was in the Dutch oven. She set up a boarding house and eatery as quickly as she could manage it, and her earnings were considerably larger than Mason's from the creek. She mentions with a frankness that the memoir does not try to soften, that the money flowed in from the kitchen in a way that it simply did not flow in from the diggings. She charged what the market would bear, and the market in the gold camps would bear a great deal. Men who had been eating badly for weeks and who had gold dust in their pockets would pay astonishing prices for a real meal, and they did, and Luzina Wilson collected. This is the reality that the romantic prospector story has always quietly suppressed. The miner's wages, such as they were, passed almost immediately through his hands into the hands of the people who fed him, housed him, cleaned his clothes, and sold him his supplies. The entire Boomtown economy was structured as a kind of funnel. Gold came up from the ground. It went immediately across the counter, across the bar, across the dinner table, and on the other side of those transactions were people who had understood much more clearly than the men in the creek where the actual money was. A meal was not a finite resource the way placer gold was a finite resource. You could cook another meal tomorrow, you could charge for it again. The creek, divided among 10,000 men, yielded a little less every week. The kitchen, serving 10,000 hungry men, yielded steadily, reliably, for as long as the men were there to be fed, and Luzina Stanley Wilson understood this. She left the rush with considerably more than she arrived with. Her husband's mining career is not what history remembers. Mary Ellen Pleasant had understood the same arithmetic long before she arrived in San Francisco, and she arrived there with already formed instincts for how economies worked and where the durable money accumulated. She was a black woman born into slavery or very near the edge of it. The precise details of her early life she deliberately kept murky, in part for her own protection in an era when specificity could be dangerous. And she had worked her way into a position by the time she reached the city from which she could see the entire landscape of the gold rush economy with unusual clarity. She ran boarding houses, she managed investments, she moved in the financial circles of the city with a combination of shrewdness and personal presence that contemporary accounts describe in terms that range from admiring to unsettled, depending on the sympathies of the person doing the describing. She accumulated wealth. She used it at considerable personal risk to fund the abolitionist cause. She is documented as having contributed money to John Brown's operations, which in the climate of the 1850s was not a small thing. She became known in San Francisco as a woman of means and influence, and she operated at a level of the city's financial world that most women of any background and virtually all black women were systematically excluded from. That she got there, that she stayed there, that she accumulated the kind of wealth that gave her genuine leverage in the city is a fact that the standard gold rush narrative, the one centered on the man with the pan, has almost no room for, because it requires acknowledging that the rush created not one story but many, and that some of the people who navigated it most successfully were people the romantic version of the story tends not to notice. She was known eventually as Mammy Pleasant. It was a name she did not always appreciate and had not chosen, but it was the name that stuck in the city's memory. San Francisco's financial and social history is considerably stranger and more interesting if you put her back into it. Up in the Klondike, roughly half a century after Wilson and Pleasant were making their calculations in California, a woman named Belinda Mulrooney arrived in Dawson City and looked around her with much the same practical clarity. She had, reportedly, thrown her last quarter into the Yukon River when she stepped off the boat, explaining to anyone who asked that she would not need it. She intended to do business here, and she intended to do it well, and small coins were not the unit she was thinking in. She brought in goods that Dawson desperately needed, bolts of cloth, among other things, and hot water bottles, which the historical record notes she sold at extraordinary markup. She understood before most of the men around her that the gold in the ground was the thing everyone was chasing, and that the people who chased the gold were the things she could build a business on. She built a roadhouse. Then she built the Fairview Hotel, which was by accounts the finest building in Dawson City. Real glass in the windows, real linen on the tables, a real establishment in a town that had been raw and desperate only recently. She is quoted, in one form or another in several accounts, as having said something to the effect that she would make her money from the miners, not from the gold. Whether the exact words are perfectly preserved is less important than the fact that they describe precisely what she did. She looked at the Boomtown and saw it for what it was, a large, concentrated, well-funded customer base, most of whose money was going to leave the Klondike in someone's pockets, and the question was only whose pockets those would be. They were, to a considerable extent, hers. There is another detail from the California rush that history has tended to treat as a curiosity, a piece of colorful trivia, but that is actually one of the most economical expressions of Boomtown logic available. In the early years of the rush, laundry, the washing of clothes, was so expensive in the diggings and so unavailable at any reasonable price that some miners reportedly shipped their dirty clothes to Hawaii or to China to be washed and returned to them. The ocean voyage could take months. They waited. Think about what that tells you. Not about the miners exactly, although it tells you something about the quality of their decision-making in certain domains. It tells you about prices. It tells you that the cost of labor in the California gold camps, any labor, including the most basic and repetitive domestic labor, was so elevated that it was cheaper to put clothes on a ship sailing thousands of miles across the Pacific than to pay someone local to wash them. Ocean freight, sailors' wages, the time value of several months without your linen. All of that came in below the cost of a laundress in Sacramento. That is a fact about wages, but it is also a fact about where money was. Anyone who could do laundry in that environment, who could wash clothes and return them the same week rather than the same year, was in possession of a service that commanded prices almost no one today would believe. The women who ran laundries in the California camps made money that the men who ran from the mines to the laundress and back could barely account for. The Boomtown economy did not care what the work was, it cared how scarce the work was and how urgently it was needed. Cooking was urgent and scarce, laundry was urgent and scarce, a clean bed in a real boarding house was urgent and scarce. The women who provided those things did not need to worry about whether the gold was running out. Their customers' need for supper and a clean shirt was not running out. And while the women ran their boarding houses and their laundries and their restaurants, and while the assayers tested their dust, and the bankers moved their gold out in strong boxes and the saloon keepers collected the nightly take, something else was happening in the economy of the Boomtown, something structural, something that the lone prospector, bent over his pan in the cold current, had almost no way of seeing coming. The easy gold was running out. This was not a surprise in retrospect. It was the inevitable mathematical consequence of what had happened. Placer gold. gold that has eroded out of its source rock and settled in riverbeds and gravel bars, gold that a man with a pan and some patience could reach, is a finite and non-renewable resource. It does not replenish. Every ounce removed is an ounce gone. And when you divide a fixed and dwindling supply among a population that was, by the early 1850s in California, numbering in the tens of thousands, the per capita return for each man working the stream drops towards something very modest, and then towards something very discouraging. The gold did not disappear all at once. It thinned. The daily take that had, in that brief and extraordinary early window of 1848, sometimes run to hundreds of dollars for a single man working a rich bar. The take dropped first to something decent, and then to something survivable, and then, for most men, to something that barely covered their daily expenses in a place where daily expenses were spectacular. The mathematical reality was implacable. You could not divide a finite pool among an exploding population and have each individual come away rich. Someone had to lose. In fact, almost everyone had to lose, because the gold that had been accessible without heavy equipment and capital was, within a few years of any major strike, essentially gone. What remained was a different kind of problem. There was still gold in the ground, hard rock gold, gold locked in quartz veins underground, gold in low concentrations distributed through hillsides and riverbeds in forms that a man with a pan could not efficiently recover. Getting at this gold required something that the individual prospector almost always lacked: capital. Significant capital. The kind of capital that could buy a steam-driven stamp mill to crush quartz ore, or the kind of capital that could buy a monitor. The monitor is worth a moment's description because it is one of the more startling technologies that the California gold rush produced, and one of the more consequential. It was essentially a very large nozzle connected to a very large pipe, connected to a very large reservoir of water held at elevation. When the valve was opened, the water came out of that nozzle at enormous pressure, and the jet it produced was powerful enough to dissolve hillsides. Entire slopes of gravel and earth that had been there since the last ice age were washed away by these machines, moved by water under pressure, turned into slurry that ran through sluices designed to trap the gold as it passed. Hydraulic mining, as this method was called, could process enormous volumes of material. It could recover gold that no panner could have touched. It could also, as the farmers and landowners downstream discovered to their considerable fury, choke rivers with debris, the grey, suffocating sediment the miners called slickens, spread across valley floors, fill riverbeds, raise water tables, destroy the farmland that had been built up along California's rivers. This was not a small or local problem. It was visible from miles away. The conflict between the hydraulic mining interests and the downstream agricultural interests built for years and came to a head in the courts, and in 1884 a federal judge named Lorenzo Sawyer issued a decision that became one of the earliest major environmental rulings in American legal history. The Sawyer decision, as it is known, prohibited the dumping of hydraulic mining debris into the waterways of California. It did not end mining, but it effectively ended the dominant form of hydraulic mining in the Sierra Nevada foothills. That detail, 1884, the Sawyer decision, Lorenzo Sawyer, matters for a specific reason. By the time that ruling came down, the individual prospector had been largely gone from the California goldfields for more than a decade. The men who held the monitors, the men who owned the stamp mills, the men who had consolidated the individual claims into corporate operations, they were the ones who cared about that ruling. They were the ones with lawyers and interests large enough to litigate. The lone prospector with his pan had not needed an environmental ruling because his impact on the landscape was modest. The men who replaced him had turned rivers grey. Consolidation happened quickly. It always did. The moment the easy surface gold was gone and capital became necessary to continue mining, the independent miner was at a structural disadvantage. He did not have the capital. The man who did have the capital, the successful merchant, the banker, the man who had arrived early and sold supplies instead of digging, could buy the independent miner's claim, often at a low price, because the miner was exhausted and out of money and ready to go home. Aggregate enough of these small claims and you have a mining district. Add the equipment, add the workers, now wage laborers, not independent prospectors, and you have an industrial operation. In the Klondike, this consolidation happened with almost indecent speed. The great corporate dredges, those enormous floating machines that ate through gravel by the millions of cubic yards, arrived in the Yukon within a few years of the rush and proceeded to work the creek bottoms in a systematic way that made the individual stampeders' efforts look, by comparison, like something a child might do with a beach pail. The lone prospector was not displaced gradually. He was made irrelevant in a very short time by the arrival of a scale of industrial operation that he could not compete with and could not afford to replicate. He had come to own a mine. He had ended up owning a wage. And through all of this, through the placer years and the hydraulic years and the hard rock years and the dredge years, the Boomtown economy was doing something to the ordinary landscape of prices and land values that deserves its own careful attention. San Francisco in 1848 was a small settlement. The population has been estimated at somewhere around 1,000 people. The lots on which its buildings sat had values consistent with what a small, not particularly prosperous settlement at the edge of a distant territory might command. They were worth something, but not much. 2 years later, by 1850, the city held approximately 25,000 people, and the price of a lot in San Francisco bore no relationship whatsoever to what a similar piece of ground had been worth in 1847, none. The numbers had not moved incrementally. They had not risen by a sensible percentage reflecting improved conditions and growing commerce. They had exploded. Land that had been essentially worthless had become spectacularly valuable in a period of time so short that the human mind struggles to process it. The people who owned that land, who had acquired it before the rush, or who had been astute enough to buy it very early and hold it, had found their fortune not underground, but at the surface. Not in the creek, but on the street. The land played the same structural trick that the pick and shovel trade had played. The value was in the position, not the extraction. You did not need to go anywhere. The crowd came to you, and what the crowd needed was somewhere to stand. Rents in the diggings and in the boomtowns followed the same logic. A man who owned a building, or a tent, or a sleeping space that another man needed could charge for it at rates that would have seemed hallucinatory to anyone who had set those rents a few years earlier. Everything in a boomtown was scarce except men with gold dust, and the scarce things, beds, meals, goods, laundry, land, absorbed the gold dust as efficiently as the ground had once released it. The boomtown was, in this sense, a wealth transfer machine. Gold came up from the ground in the hands of the men who dug it, and then it moved, with great speed and near-perfect efficiency, into the hands of the people who had positioned themselves at every level above and around the digging. The digger did the physical work. Everyone else did the capturing. And it is honest, in accounting for who captured the money and who did the work, to acknowledge something that the prospector romance tends to leave out entirely. The boomtown economy was built on foundations that had cost someone very greatly. The land on which the diggings sat had been, not long before, the territory of people who had lived on it for a very long time. The California rush arrived with extraordinary speed onto land belonging to native peoples who had no say in whether the gold beneath their feet would be extracted, or by whom, or at what cost to the way of life they had built there. The cost was enormous. The miners and the camps and the hydraulic operations and the deforestation for fuel and the damming and diversion of streams did damage to landscapes and to the peoples who depended on those landscapes that was severe. and in many cases irreversible. That cost was paid by people who received nothing from the transfer. The gold moved from the ground into the pockets of the merchants and the bankers and the landowners, and what was left behind was a wound in the land and the near destruction of communities whose history went back thousands of years. The economic story cannot be told honestly without holding that alongside the price of eggs and the returns on the pick and shovel trade. The Boomtown ran on the labor of many people who were not well compensated for what they gave. The Chinese miners who worked claims that white miners had abandoned or forced them off, who were subjected to discriminatory taxes and violence, and finally to the exclusion acts that would push them out of the mining districts, are part of this story. The Mexican and Chilean and Peruvian miners who had arrived early, who knew the placer techniques better than most of the Anglo newcomers, and who were systematically driven from the best ground by organized violence and by legal devices that the dominant population controlled. They are part of this story. The Boomtown economy generated wealth. It did not distribute it equitably. The people at the top of the pyramid, with the Brannans and the Strauss and the Stanfords and the Wells and Fargos, did not bear the costs of what it took to make the pyramid stand. That is the full picture of the price paid. It is the part of the accounting that the phrase "mining the miners" does not capture, because mining the miners is what happened above the surface. Below the surface of the story and at its edges was something harder to look at and harder to account for in the ledger. And then the gold ran out. Not all at once, but in each town, in each district, in each creek, the day arrived when the viable gold was gone, when the cost of continuing to extract it exceeded the value being extracted, when the companies shut down their operations and the wage laborers dispersed, and the camp that had been a city was left standing empty. The departure was as fast as the arrival, faster sometimes, because when men had come to the rush, they had come with hope, which is a kind of inertia. It keeps you moving in one direction, even when the rational case for the direction is weak. When men left the ruins of a boomtown, they left with nothing, or with very little, and nothing travels light and fast. They were gone quickly. Body, California, is what remains. Or rather, what remains of what remains. Body sits in the high desert east of the Sierra Nevada, at an elevation where the winters are severe and the growing season is nearly non-existent. It had, at its peak, a population of perhaps several thousand people. Historians give varying estimates, but it was a real and functioning town with hotels and saloons and a main street and a mill. It had schools. It had a post office. It had crime, considerable crime. Body in its boom years had a reputation for violence that even other boom towns noticed. And then it declined, and the mill closed, and the miners left, and the businesses that had served the miners followed, and eventually Body was what it is now, a preserved ruin protected by the state of California as a historical park, the buildings standing in the cold desert air exactly as they were left by the last people who walked out of them. Cans still on the shelves, a pool table, the shell of the mill. The wind, very cold, moving between the buildings. Body is not unique, it is the archetype. Every boomtown that was built on the extraction of a finite and non-renewable resource faced the same arithmetic. The party lasted as long as the resource. When the resource was gone, the party ended, and the guests left, and the hosts, the ones who had owned the property and the businesses, took what they could carry and went somewhere else. The Klondike's decline came with unusual drama and unusual speed. In 1899, within a year of the great flood of stampeders that had filled Dawson City to its limit, news arrived that gold had been found at Nome on the coast of Alaska. The gold was reportedly lying on the beaches, which is not precisely accurate, but is the kind of story that spreads very fast among men who have spent a year digging without finding much. Nome, beaches, gold, simple. They left. almost all of them. The population of Dawson City, which had swelled to numbers it was never designed to support, drained away in what contemporaries described as a near instantaneous exodus. Boats loaded, men who had just arrived, or had been there for a year, or had been there through the brutal winter. They loaded their belongings, and they went down the river, and they turned west toward the coast, and they went to Nome. Dawson was left with the people who had reasons to stay, the ones who had real permanent investments, the ones who had built things that could not be easily moved, the ones who had decided, for whatever reason, that this was where they would remain. The town did not disappear entirely. It exists today, a small city in the Yukon, carrying its history carefully. But the Boomtown Dawson, the Dawson of 30,000 people and impossible prices, and Belinda Mulrooney's Fairview Hotel, and the dance halls and the gold dust tips, and the sweepings from the saloon floor, that Dawson was over in a season. The crowd that built the boom had simply moved to the next rumor. This was the final lesson the Boomtown had to teach, and it is the one that the people who had positioned themselves wisely had understood from the beginning. The crowd was not permanent. The crowd was a weather system. It formed, it rained gold on a particular landscape, and it moved on. The people who built durable wealth were the ones who had understood that the crowd was temporary and had made arrangements that would outlast it. Levi Strauss had made such an arrangement. He was not selling pans to miners. He was building a brand, a product, a manufacturing process, a distribution network. The company he built did not depend on the California diggings remaining productive. When the rush moved on and the independent miners dispersed and the corporate operations replaced them, Levi Strauss & Company continued. The riveted trousers that he and Jacob Davis had patented in 1873 were sold not just to miners, but to workers of every kind in every industry in every state. The company he built outlived not just the California rush, but every subsequent rush, every boom and every bust, the entire century of American industrial expansion, and is with us still. That is what durable wealth looks like. It is not a pan full of gold. It is a thing that people will need after the gold is gone. Wells, Fargo and Company had made a similar arrangement. The banking and express business that Henry Wells and William Fargo had built during the California rush was not about California specifically. It was about the infrastructure of moving and safeguarding value. When the California diggings played out, Wells Fargo had customers everywhere. Individuals, businesses, governments, who needed exactly what Wells Fargo provided. The gold rush had given the company its start, its capital, its reputation, its geographic footprint. But the company had grown beyond its origin in the same way that a river grows beyond its source spring. Henry Wells and William Fargo never needed a pan. The Central Pacific Railroad, the western half of the first transcontinental railroad completed in 1869, was built by a group of men who had understood, better than almost anyone else in California, the ultimate lesson of the rush. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, the Big Four. They had come to California during the rush, not primarily as miners, but as merchants. They had sold things to miners. They had built the capital that the rush generated, and then, with that capital, they had looked at the landscape of California and asked what it would need next. What it needed next was a railroad. The railroad required capital they did not initially have in full, but they knew how to raise it, and they had the political connections the rush had helped them build. Leland Stanford had been governor of California, and they had the vision for what a transcontinental link would do for trade and commerce and land values across the entire western half of the continent. They built it with Chinese labor, much of it under brutal conditions. They built it with federal land grants and federal financing that amounted to one of the largest government subsidies in the nation's history to that point. They built it on the backs of workers who were paid very little for very dangerous work in very unforgiving terrain. And when it was done, they were among the wealthiest men in the United States. Stanford built a university. Huntington built a railroad empire. The names persist. The wealth that eventually became Stanford University's founding endowment, the wealth that built the campus in the hills south of San Francisco, that paid the professors and the administrators and the construction crews and the librarians, that wealth traces back through a long and winding chain of investment and accumulation and political maneuvering to a hardware store in Sacramento, to the sale of shovels and picks and pans to men who went looking for gold and mostly did not find enough of it. There is a university in California whose money started in a hardware store. The open loop resolves there. It resolves with a peculiar kind of wonder if you sit with it for a moment. The notion that education, that the long, slow work of a research institution, that classrooms and laboratories and libraries could be downstream of the pick and shovel trade. That the gold rush, which was in many ways a story about the failure of the people who did the digging, was also a story about the spectacular success of the people who sold the tools. The pipeline runs gold in the ground, miners' labor, merchants' counter, merchants' capital, railroad, land, endowment, university, ideas that outlast everything. The gold itself is long gone from those California streams. What it built is still standing. And Samuel Brannan, the man who began this whole account, the man with the 20-cent pan that sold for $15, the man who ran through the streets of San Francisco shouting about the American River and then went back to his store to wait for the customers he had just created, Samuel Brannan had a coda that is worth sitting with. He got richest fastest. He was, by some accounts, California's first millionaire, and he got there before the rush had really even gathered its full momentum. He understood the machine better than almost anyone. He had seen with extraordinary clarity the difference between where the gold was and where the money was, and he had positioned himself on the right side of that gap before almost anyone else knew the gap existed, and then he lost most of it. The land speculation went wrong. The investments did not all pay out. A costly and bitter divorce in the 1870s consumed a very large portion of what remained. The man who had been California's first millionaire spent his last years in poverty and died in 1889 without the wealth that his name had once been synonymous with. This is not, in the end, a comforting coda if you are looking for reassurance that cleverness is enough. Capturing wealth and keeping wealth are two different skills, and the history of the gold rush is full of people who demonstrated one without the other. The saloon keeper who drank his profits, the merchant who expanded too fast when the boom was already ending, the man who sold his claim just before it yielded or held it just past the point where selling made sense. The rush rewarded timing and nerve and positioning, but it did not guarantee that the people who were right about one thing would be right about everything that came after. Brannan was right about the most important thing. He was not right about everything, and the gap between those two states of affairs cost him the fortune that his best insight had built. So who, in the end, left the gold rush wealthy? The answer has been building since the first pages of this account, and by now you have heard it at every level of the pyramid. It was not primarily the men with the pans. It was the man who sold the pans before the crowds arrived, at extraordinary markup. It was the woman who fed the men who bought the pans every evening at prices the men paid without complaint because they were hungry, and the alternative was worse. It was the banker who moved the gold out of the camp in a strongbox and who collected a fee for doing so that added up across thousands of transactions to something very substantial. It was the man who looked at a Boomtown lot in 1848 when the lot was worth nearly nothing, and who held it until 1850 when it was worth a great deal and then sold it. It was the entrepreneur who understood that the crowd was temporary and built a thing that would still be useful when the crowd was gone. It was the one who saw that the real product was not the gold. The gold was just the reason people came, but the hunger and the laundry and the need for a bed and the longing for a game of cards in a warm room after a cold day in the creek. The gold rush was a story about human hope. It was a story about the power of a rumor and the depth of the human desire to believe that somewhere, just over the next pass, there is a fortune waiting that requires only the courage to go and get it. That story is not false. It is true in the way that stories can be true while still being incomplete. There were men who arrived early and found the gold in quantities that changed their lives. There were genuine fortunes dug from the ground by men with pans and shovels and a great deal of persistence, but they were the exception, and the exception is what made the rule work. Because for the machine to run, for the merchants to profit and the saloons to fill and the boarding houses to stay at capacity and the express wagons to keep moving and the land to keep appreciating, someone had to believe in sufficient numbers that they were going to be the exception. The crowd that kept coming, wave after wave, rush after rush, California, then Colorado, then the Black Hills, then the Klondike, then Nome. That crowd was the fuel. Not the fuel for the extraction of the gold, though it was that too, the fuel for the transfer, the mechanism by which money moved from the many to the few. The crowd's belief was the engine of the Boomtown economy, and every person in that crowd was, in some sense, understandable. The man who crossed the plains in a wagon with his wife and children, the man who paid a steep passage on a ship around the Horn, the man who carried 100 pounds of gear up the golden stairs in the dark, in January, in the Klondike winter. They were not fools. They were people who had been given a story that was just true enough at its beginning to sustain the hope for a very long time. The story said, there is gold and anyone can get it. And if you are willing to make the journey and do the work, the fortune is within reach. The story was not wrong about the gold. It was only wrong about the anyone. The anyone, it turned out, mattered enormously. The early men, the first men in before the crowd, the men who happened to be there in 1848 before the news had spread, they found what the story promised. Everyone who came after them found a different situation, more crowded, more expensive, more depleted, more capital intensive, and governed by an economy in which the transfer of wealth from those who dug to those who supplied and serviced had already been thoroughly institutionalized by the time they arrived. They were joining a machine. They were its moving parts. The men who owned the machine were not, for the most part, in the creek. The Boomtown is quiet now. The picks and the shovels are in museums or rusting in the dirt of places like Bodie, standing perfectly still in the cold air of that high-altitude ghost town where the wind comes through the empty buildings and the light in the afternoon is something extraordinary, long and golden and slanting, the kind of light that makes even ruin look beautiful. The shelves with their old tins, the pool table, the outline of the mill. Dawson City has its history museums and its summer tourists, and the Yukon River running cold and clear past the town the way it ran in 1898, indifferent to the human drama that played out along its banks. The creeks where the stampeders dug are still there. They are mostly quiet. The companies that survived the rush are still with us. The clothing company that started in a dry goods store, the banking and express company that started by moving other men's gold, the railroad that started with the capital that selling shovels built, the university whose wealth traces back through land and politics and merchant acumen to a storefront in Sacramento. The gold is long gone, the structures it built are everywhere. Here, in the last quiet of this account, is what the whole pyramid adds up to. Every level had its logic. Every position in the Boomtown economy made sense from the inside. The prospector was rational to try because the story was true enough. The merchant was rational to sell because the demand was extraordinary. The saloon keeper and the assayer and the banker and the boarding house owner and the claim baron were each making a rational calculation about where the money was and how to get in front of it. The difference between the levels was not effort. The miners worked very hard. The difference was not courage. It takes genuine courage to cross a continent or climb an icy mountain pass carrying 100 pounds in the dark. The difference was position. Where you stood in relation to the flow of gold determined whether gold flowed toward you or away from you. The miner stood at the source. He touched the gold first. But the gold did not stay with him because every step from the creek to the bank was another hand that took a portion, and by the time the miner's gold had passed through the merchant's store and the saloon and the landlord and the express wagon, there was very little of it left in his own hands. Position in the flow of value. That is the lesson the Boomtown economy taught over and over in California, and the Klondike and every rush in between. The man at the source of a river touches the water first, but the towns are built downstream. You have traveled the whole length of the pyramid tonight. You have stood at the creek in the cold water with your pan. You have stood behind the counter with your inflated prices and your monopoly on shovels. You have sat at the assayer's bench with your scales. You have poured a drink in a saloon where the floor sweepings were worth counting. You have cooked a meal in a boarding house kitchen and watched the money come in faster than the creek ever produced it. You have watched the consolidators arrive with their monitors and their capital, and you have watched the lone prospector pack his things and go. You have watched the town fill up beyond anything it was built for, and you have watched it empty again, almost overnight, when the next rumor came from Nome. You have walked through Bodie in the long afternoon light. You have seen what remains. And what remains in the end is the understanding of the machine. The Boomtown economy was not a mystery. It obeyed logic. It rewarded position over effort, durable service over ephemeral extraction, the second-order transaction over the first. It was not kind to the people who believed most fervently in the story, because the story, however understandable, was structured to keep them digging while someone else did the counting. The man with the pan, the man with the store. They stood in the same Boomtown, breathing the same air, hearing the same music from the saloon. One of them understood where the money was. The other was where the money came from. Tonight, let that understanding settle. Let the arithmetic rest. The creeks are quiet, the mountains are still. Somewhere in the dark, the old Boomtowns sit in the landscape. Some of them ruins, some of them cities, some of them universities. And the long-ago gold that started it all is spent and gone and transmuted into everything they became. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.